The year was 1884, and the wind across the Dakota plains was a thing without mercy. It scoured the land flat, gnawed at the sparse, thirsty grass, and carried the dust of 1,000 barren miles in its teeth. For the young Lakota woman they called Winona, the wind was just another voice in a chorus of loss. It howled like the grief in her own chest, a sound so constant it had become a part of the silence that now defined her world. She sat on the hard bench of the wagon, her hands bound loosely in her lap, a precaution that was both an insult and a redundancy. There was nowhere left for her to run. Her world had been burned to the ground, not by soldiers, but by the slow, creeping sickness that had taken her mother, then her father, then the elders who held their stories. Her brother, desperate and hollowed out by starvation, had made a bargain. He had traded her, his only remaining family, for a repeating rifle, 2 sacks of flour, and a bottle of whiskey that would likely kill him before the winter did. He had not looked at her as the 2 white men, trappers with eyes like chips of ice, had led her away. He had simply stared at the rifle in his hands, as if it held the weight of a world he could no longer save. Now she was property, a commodity. The word was a stone in her gut. The men spoke little to her, and when they did, it was in a gruff, dismissive English she only partially understood. They saw the intricate beadwork on her worn doskin dress not as art, but as a feature of the merchandise. They saw the long, dark braid that fell past her waist, not as a mark of her heritage, but as an asset. They did not see the person inside, the spirit that felt as though it were fraying thread by thread, dissolving into the relentless dust. Her life had become a state of quiet resignation, a long, monotonous breath held in anticipation of the final, crushing blow. She had become a ghost long before her body had given up. The journey lasted for what felt like an eternity, etched in jolting wheels and the flat, endless horizon. Finally, the wagon crested a low rise, and a homestead came into view, stark and solitary against the bruised purple of the approaching dusk. It was not a large place. A small, sturdy cabin built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud sat beside a lean-to barn. A few fenced-in corrals held a handful of cattle and 2 horses that lifted their heads at their approach. The place seemed to be holding its breath, braced against the vast emptiness that surrounded it. It looked like the loneliest place on earth. A man emerged from the cabin, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall and broad in the shoulder, his form solid and unyielding like the land itself. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, no motion wasted. As the wagon drew closer, she saw the lines etched around his eyes and mouth, the kind that came not from smiling, but from squinting into the sun and holding back words. His hair was the color of dried corn silk, his jaw shadowed with stubble. He did not look cruel, not in the way the trappers did. He simply looked weathered, worn down to the essential, like a stone in a riverbed. The trapper named Pike grunted, pulling the wagon to a halt. "Callahan. Got what you paid for." The man, Callahan, nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the wagon, over the men, and finally settling on her. Winona stared back, her expression a careful mask of blankness. She would not show him her fear. She would not give him that. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a profound stillness, a deep well of something she could not name. There was no avarice in his look, no triumph. There was only a deep, abiding weariness. The transaction was swift and brutal in its simplicity. Callahan passed a small leather pouch to Pike, who weighed it in his hand and grunted in satisfaction. "She's all yours. Don't speak much English. But she's healthy enough." The other trapper let out a coarse laugh. Callahan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Get off my land." His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was not a request. The trappers, surprised by the cold finality in his tone, wasted no time. They nudged their horses, turned the wagon, and rumbled away, their laughter swallowed by the immense silence of the plains. They left her sitting on the wagon bench, a piece of luggage delivered and abandoned. She was alone with him, the man who had bought her. This, she thought, Was it the end of the path? She braced herself, her spirit shrinking to a hard, small point inside her chest. He stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping strands of hair around his face. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw the flicker of something in those tired eyes. It might have been pity. That was worse than cruelty. He walked to the wagon and reached for the rope that bound her wrists. She flinched, pulling back, a cornered animal preparing for a strike. He stopped instantly, holding his hands up, palms open. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice softer now. He gestured to the ropes, just that. He waited. When she did not move, he took a small knife from his belt and, with a single, careful motion, sliced through the rope. It fell away from her wrists. He made no move to touch her. He simply stepped back, giving her space. Then he turned and walked toward the cabin. He left the door open and disappeared inside. He did not command her to follow. He did not drag her. He left the choice to her, though it was no choice at all. Stay in the wagon and freeze when the night came, or enter the den of the wolf who had just purchased her. After a long hesitation, her limbs stiff and cold, Winona slid from the wagon and, with feet that felt like lead, walked toward the square of light that spilled from the open cabin door. The cabin was a single room, clean and spare. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within it, casting dancing shadows. There was a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a dry sink, and shelves holding a few plates and tins. In one corner was a bed, neatly made. But it was the other side of the room that held her attention. Against the far wall was a small cot, a thin mattress covered with a clean but patched blanket. Arthur Callahan stood by the hearth, his back to her. "The cot is yours," he said, his voice quiet, directed at the fire. "There's stew on the stove. Eat when you're hungry." He did not turn around. He did not look at her. He had given her a bed that was not his own. Winona stood frozen in the doorway, confusion warring with a suspicion so deep it was instinct. This was a trick, a test. Men did not buy women to give them their own space. It was a lie, a prelude to the violence she knew was coming. She remained by the door, a silent sentinel, watching his back. He eventually took a bowl of stew for himself and sat at the table, his shoulders slumped. He ate slowly, his eyes fixed on the wooden grain of the tabletop. He did not speak to her again. The silence in that small cabin was a living thing. It was heavier than a blanket, thicker than the night outside. It was filled with the ghosts of his life and the fresh wounds of hers. After he finished eating, he washed his bowl and utensils, then took a worn book from a shelf and sat in the chair by the fire. He did not look at her, did not acknowledge her presence, but she felt his awareness of her in the rigid set of his shoulders. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Finally, driven by a gnawing emptiness in her stomach, she moved. Every step was deliberate. She ladled a small amount of the warm stew into a bowl, her eyes never leaving him. He did not move, did not look up from his book. She retreated to the furthest corner, sinking to the floor with her back against the rough-hewn logs, and ate. The stew was simple venison and root vegetables, but it was hot, and it pushed back the cold that had settled deep in her bones. When he finally rose and banked the fire for the night, he glanced at her corner. "There are extra blankets in the chest," he said, his voice a low rumble. Then he went to his own bed, pulled off his boots and lay down, turning his face to the wall. Winona did not sleep on the cot. She could not bring herself to trust its softness, its vulnerability. Instead, she took one of the blankets he had indicated and wrapped herself in it, remaining on the floor in her corner, her back pressed firmly against the security of the wall. She watched the faint orange glow of the embers and listened to the sound of his steady breathing, waiting for the lie to reveal itself. But the night passed in an unbroken, deafening silence, and the attack she was so certain would come never did. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Arthur rose before the sun, his movements quiet and efficient. He would start the fire, put coffee on to boil, and head out to the barn to tend to his animals. He never spoke to her in the mornings, never demanded she cook or clean or do anything at all. He simply left food on the stove, usually oatmeal or biscuits from the night before, and went about his work. Winona watched him from the cabin window. She watched him mend fences with chapped, calloused hands. She watched him haul water from the well, the muscles in his back straining against his worn shirt. She watched him gentle, a skittish horse, his voice low and soothing, his touch patient. He moved with a purpose that seemed to be the only thing holding him together. He was a man drowning in solitude, and his work was the only shore in sight. She remained a ghost in his house. She ate only after he had left, cleaned her bowl, and retreated to her corner. She did not speak. Speech was a part of a world she no longer belonged to. Her words were for her people, and her people were gone. To speak to him would be a betrayal of that memory, an acceptance of this cage, no matter how strangely gilded it was. Her suspicion did not fade. It merely settled into a low, constant hum. She studied him, searching for the crack in his placid exterior, the hint of the monster beneath. She noted the way he never looked directly at her for more than a fleeting second, as if her presence was something he could only bear in his periphery. She saw the deep sadness that settled in his eyes when he thought he was unobserved, a grief as vast and empty as the plains outside. One afternoon, he came in from the barn, his face grim. He was carrying something small and grey in his hands. It was a fledgling, fallen from a nest somewhere under the eaves. Its wing was bent at an unnatural angle. He placed it gently in a small wooden box lined with a scrap of cloth. "Poor thing," he murmured, more to himself than to her, "broke its wing." He tried to give it water from a dropper, but the bird was too panicked and weak. He sat with the box on his lap for a long time, his large, rough hand resting near it, as if his presence alone could offer some comfort. Winona watched from her corner. She knew a poultice of yarrow might ease the swelling, a splint from a fine twig might set the bone. It was knowledge passed down from her grandmother, but she said nothing. She kept her knowledge locked away with her voice. The bird died before morning. He buried it behind the barn under a small pile of stones. He did not speak of it, but a fresh layer of sorrow seemed to have settled upon him. The change began not with a word, but with a needle. Weeks had passed. She had noticed the way he fumbled with a needle and thread one evening, trying to patch a significant tear in his only good coat. His fingers, so capable with an axe or reins, were clumsy and thick. He pricked himself twice, muttering under his breath in frustration before giving up and tossing the coat aside. The next day, while he was out on the range checking on his cattle, Winona took the coat. Her own needle and sinew were long gone, but she found his pathetic mending kit in a drawer. The needle was too large, the thread too coarse, but her fingers remembered their purpose. They moved with a swift, sure grace that had been absent for months. She stitched the tear with small, even stitches, reinforcing the seam, making it stronger than it had been before. It was not the fine work she could do with her own tools, but it was sturdy. It was whole again. She left the coat folded neatly on his chair. When he came in that evening, chilled from the wind, he saw it immediately. He stopped, staring at it. He picked it up, running his thumb over the neat line of her stitches. He turned his head and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since she had arrived. His blue eyes were wide with a startled kind of wonder. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. Instead, he gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. It was the first real communication that had passed between them, a silent acknowledgement, an offering, accepted. From that day on, a subtle shift occurred. It was not a truce, but a lessening of hostilities in the silent war she had been waging. She began to help in small ways. She would rise early and have the coffee ready for him. She would sweep the floor, not because she was a servant, but because the dust felt oppressive. He, in turn, began to leave things for her. One day, he left a small stack of paper and a piece of charcoal on the cot, as if sensing her need for an outlet. For days, she ignored it. Then, one quiet afternoon, she picked it up and began to draw. She drew the face of her mother, the shape of the hills near her old camp, the eagle she had seen soaring the day before. She drew the world she had lost, bringing it back to life with smudged lines of black on white. The autumn bled into a harsh, unforgiving winter. A blizzard descended upon them without warning, a churning vortex of white that erased the world. For 3 days, they were trapped in the cabin, the wind shrieking like a tormented spirit. The small space, once a battlefield of silence, became a shared vessel against the storm. The forced proximity was an intimacy neither of them was prepared for. On the second day, a section of the barn roof, burdened by the heavy snow, gave way with a sickening crack. Without a word, they both pulled on their coats and boots and plunged into the blinding tempest. They had to get the animals out. The wind tore at them, ice stinging their faces. Inside the damaged barn, the horses panicked, their eyes wide with terror. While Arthur fought to calm the stallion, a heavy beam, dislodged by the wind, crashed down. He shoved the horse clear but was not fast enough to get himself fully out of the way. The beam struck his leg, and he went down with a sharp cry of pain. Winona's hesitation lasted only a heartbeat. She saw him on the ground, his face pale, trying to rise. She ran to his side. "My leg," he gasped, his teeth gritted. "I think it's broken." In that moment, he was not her owner, not a white man, not her captor. He was just a person in pain, and her instincts, the deep-seated knowledge of her people, took over. Working together, she acting as his crutch, they managed to get back to the cabin, the storm raging around them. She cut away his pant leg with his own knife. The lower leg was already swelling, the bone clearly broken. Panic tried to claw at her, but she pushed it down. She remembered what the elders taught. She was her grandmother's daughter. She became the calm at the center of their own small storm. "Splint," she said, the first word she had spoken to him. It felt strange and rusty in her throat. He stared at her, his eyes clouded with pain but clear with surprise. "The floorboards, under my bed, straight-grained pine." She found them, and with his axe, she deftly split 2 straight pieces. She tore strips from a clean sheet for bindings. As she worked, she sent him to fetch snow to pack around the injury to keep the swelling down. She set the bone with a swift, practiced movement that made him cry out, a sharp, guttural sound he quickly stifled. Then she bound the leg tightly between the splints. Her hands were gentle but firm, her focus absolute. For the next week, he was helpless, confined to his bed. The roles were reversed. She was now the caretaker. She tended the fire, cooked the food, and ventured out into the snow to feed the animals and ensure they had water. She crushed willow bark, boiling it into a bitter tea to help with his pain. She changed his dressings. She worked tirelessly, moving with a quiet competence that amazed him. In the long hours of his convalescence, the silence between them began to fill with words. At first, he did the talking, his voice weak and raspy. He told her about the ranch, how he'd built the cabin with his own 2 hands. He told her about his wife, Martha, and their son, Daniel. They had been taken by fever 3 winters ago. He pointed to a small, carved wooden horse on the mantelpiece. "Daniel's," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. He was only 5. He had not just been worn down by the land, he had been hollowed out by grief. His solitude was not a choice, it was a prison, same as hers. Winona listened, her hands busy with some task, but her attention fixed on his words. She saw the photograph he kept by his bed, a smiling woman with kind eyes, and a small boy with Arthur's fair hair. She looked at the raw pain in his face and recognized it as a mirror of her own. The chasm between them, once vast and impassable, began to feel more like a shared wound. One evening, as she sat by the fire mending a shirt, he asked her about the symbols she had drawn on her scraps of paper. Hesitantly at first, then, with more confidence, she began to speak. She told him her real name, the one her mother had given her, which meant firstborn daughter. She told him about her people, the way they followed the buffalo, the stories the elders told under the stars. She spoke of the scent of sagebrush after a rain and the sound of the drums during a ceremony. As she spoke, the ghost in the cabin began to take on flesh and blood again. She was not just a survivor, she was the keeper of a world that was vanishing. He listened, his gaze intent, seeing her, truly seeing her for the very first time. When the snow finally thawed and the world outside reappeared, something essential had changed between them. The cabin was no longer a prison and a hiding place, but a shared shelter. The silence that fell between them now was not one of tension, but of comfort. They worked together, a partnership forged in hardship. He taught her to shoot his rifle, respecting her steady hand and keen eye. She taught him which wild plants were medicine and which were food. A tentative, fragile trust had taken root in the frozen ground of their sorrow. One afternoon in early spring, he hitched the wagon and went into the small settlement that passed for a town, a journey he made only a few times a year for supplies. He returned late, his face set in a grim line. As he unloaded sacks of flour and salt, Winona noticed he was quiet in a way he had not been for months. It was the old, closed-off silence. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft. He finished unloading a crate before he finally spoke, his back still to her. "Men in town, they were talking. Pike and his partner have been bragging about the woman they sold to the grieving widower Callahan." His voice was laced with self-loathing. "They talk about you like you're a horse I bought at auction." He finally turned to face her, and the shame in his eyes was a physical thing. "I'm sorry, for my part in this. I was so lost. I never should have." "You did not treat me like a horse," she said simply. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice raw. "That's how they see it. And a man named Vance, he runs things in that town. He said, a man like me has no business with an Indian. Said it wasn't right. He and his friends, they were drunk. They said they might ride out to see the merchandise for themselves." A cold dread settled in Winona's stomach. She knew men like that, men whose cruelty was fueled by ignorance and whiskey. They were the ones who saw her people as savages, as less than human, as things to be used and discarded. "We will be ready for them," she said, her chin high. Her fear was real, but so was the fierce, protective instinct that had risen within her. This small cabin, this harsh piece of land, had become her home. And Arthur, the man who had shown her kindness when she expected only brutality, was her. She didn't have a word for what he was. But she would not let them harm him. They did not have to wait long. 3 days later, 5 riders appeared on the horizon, moving with the swagger of men who believed the world belonged to them. Arthur met them in the yard, his shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. Winona watched from the window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Arthur's rifle was propped by the door, loaded and ready. A large, florid-faced man, she assumed, was Vance dismounted. "Callahan," he sneered, his eyes flicking past Arthur to the cabin. "We heard you've got yourself some company. Came to be neighborly." "You're a long way from home, Vance," Arthur said, his voice level, "and you're not welcome here." "Now, is that any way to be?" Vance chuckled, a greasy sound. "We just want to look at the squaw you bought. Heard she's a pretty one. A man gets lonely out here. Maybe you'd be willing to share." His companions laughed along with him. "She is not for you to look at," Arthur said, his knuckles white on the stock of his gun. "She is under my protection. This is my home. Now turn around and ride out." Vance's smile vanished, replaced by an ugly scowl. "Protection. You hear that, boys? He's protecting it, getting mighty possessive of his property. You think you can stand against all of us, Callahan, over a savage?" He took a step forward. "We'll take what we want, starting with her." The men behind him began to spread out, their intentions clear. Arthur raised the shotgun, the double click of the hammers being cocked sounding unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He was outnumbered, and they all knew it. His stand was brave, but it was likely futile. Just as Vance and his men prepared to rush him, the cabin door swung open. Winona stepped out onto the porch. She was not cowering, she was not weeping. She stood tall and straight, her face a mask of cold fury. In her hands, she held Arthur's rifle, and she held it with the ease of someone who knew how to use it. She raised the weapon to her shoulder, the barrel pointed squarely at Vance's chest. She did not tremble. The men stopped dead, their drunken bravado faltering in the face of this unexpected defiance. They had come expecting to intimidate a broken man and terrorize a helpless woman. They found instead two people standing as one, a silent, deadly promise in their eyes. The sight of the Lakota woman, so fierce and resolute, holding a rifle with deadly intent, shattered their narrative. She was not a piece of property. She was a warrior defending her home. Vance stared, his jaw slack. He looked from Arthur's shotgun to Winona's rifle, and the fight seemed to drain out of him. This was not the easy sport he had anticipated. This would cost blood. "This ain't over, Callahan," he spat, but his threat was hollow. He remounted his horse, his eyes full of hate. "You and your squaw, you'll regret this." His men, their courage gone, scrambled to follow his lead. They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent curses in their wake. Arthur slowly lowered his shotgun, his shoulders sagging with relief. He turned to Winona, who still stood on the porch, the rifle held steady. Their eyes met across the yard, and in that shared look, everything was said. The last wall between them crumbled into dust and blew away on the wind. She had not just stood with him, she had stood for him, for them, for the home they had unknowingly built together. That evening, the silence in the cabin was different yet again. It was peaceful, imbued with a deep, unshakable calm. After their simple meal, Arthur turned to her, his expression serious, his pale blue eyes full of an emotion that made her heart ache in a way she had not thought possible. "Winona," he began, his voice thick. "What happened today? You saved me. You saved this place." He shook his head, struggling for words. When I made that deal, I was a man lost in the dark. I didn't know what else to do, but I swore to myself I would not be the kind of man who would own another person. I hoped I could offer you a refuge at least, but I never imagined." He stepped closer, his gaze earnest and vulnerable. "You are not my property. You never were. You are the strongest, bravest person I have ever known. This is your home, for as long as you want it. If you choose to stay," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "not as my ward, not as someone under my protection, but as an equal, a partner." He swallowed hard. "I would like to spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of you. Let me earn your heart, Winona. I will not demand it. I will not assume it. I will simply try to earn it." Winona looked at this man, this quiet, grieving man who had been sold a wife and had instead chosen to try and win a friend. He had seen her humanity when no one else had, even when she had hidden it from him. He had offered her not a cage, but a sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, she had found not just safety, but herself. She did not have the words in his language to tell him all that was in her heart, to tell him that he had already earned it. That his quiet decency, his shared sorrow, his unwavering respect had been a balm to her wounded spirit. That he had taken the shattered pieces of her life and given her a place to begin putting them back together. So instead, she reached out and gently took his calloused, weathered hand in hers. Her touch was light, but it held the weight of a promise. She looked up into his tired, hopeful eyes and gave him a small, genuine smile. And for the first time since she had been stolen from her world, she spoke a word from her own language, a word that needed no translation. "How?" she said softly. "Yes." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the vast, empty plains in hues of rose and gold. The wind still blew, but it no longer sounded like a voice of loss. It sounded like a whisper of possibility. In the small cabin, two lonely souls, survivors of their own private wars, stood hand in hand, no longer defined by what they had lost, but by the new, unexpected home they had found in each other.